Hi, fantastic. Brilliant. Well, welcome everyone. Future Work Scotland. Great to see lots of familiar faces and names. I'm Sathpal Singh, and because we Sath, I'm your host for this session. I'm joined by my co-host, Donald Henderson. Just the usual formalities. We've got code of conduct. Everyone to have a great experience, and just for you all to be respectful to one another over the course of the session. In terms of Q&A, I'm going to pass over to Sheila in a second. If you've got questions for Sheila this evening, please drop them into the chat. Prefix them with a Q so Donald and I can spot them, and then we'll relay them back to Sheila towards the end. And we'll do some usual community shout outs at the end of the session. So yeah, delighted Sheila's joining us here. We did have to cancel Sheila's previously, so I'm super glad we got it back in the schedule, and here we are, and it's such an important topic. So I'm sure you'll all agree, so I'm really looking forward to hearing Sheila's take on it and learning something tonight. Sheila's got an extraordinary background. She's been doing this stuff for some years, over 10 years. She's in leadership and coaching, a lot of stuff in management, got an insane amount of qualifications in coaching and psychology and a whole various other things. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really, really informative and educational evening for us all. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sheila so we can learn some more about diversity in practice. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thanks a million, Sath. I appreciate it. And Donald, for inviting me. I will share some slides there in a second to give us a little bit of a framework. This is going to be as conversational as I can have it, but obviously we'll be using chat. So there are questions I'm going to ask you, and there's a reason for it. It's so that this talk, the way it's been designed is that it alters based on the interactions of the people in the group. So I'm not just talking at you, we're actually having a conversation that leads us to a deeper understanding. So I'm going to share the screen. Now, Sath already stole my intro piece, which is Where Are You in the World? So that's not going to be my intro piece now. But so I'll start by just kind of naming it. So I originally dubbed this Diversity in Practice Masterclass. I'll talk to you about that towards the end. I wrote it specifically for leaders, mentors, and coaches because I work with leaders from middle management up to senior leaders nationally and internationally. I'm based in Ireland. And I also do a lot of supervising of mentors and coaches, both in Ireland and abroad. So I started to see that there was this missing piece for people who are responsible for other people in some way. So leaders are leading, mentors and coaches are trying to facilitate. And I noticed that actually all of the training that I was facilitating had inherited as a coach or a trainer, but equally was designing, often ignored this, which was that the people we work with and the people that we have a relationship with come from different backgrounds, and sometimes that's not visible. And sometimes we aren't psychologically inclusive because that hasn't come up in the training until the last couple of years. So about the last 2 years, that's how recent some of the realities of inclusion have become. We've talked about diversity and inclusion for a very long time, but when we look over the material, the actual practice of inclusion is another thing. And that's what we're going to look at today, is that diversity in practice. And I'd love your input on it. So to kick us off, let me press the right buttons. That's a good start, isn't it? So I was going to ask you to tell me where you were in the world, but we kind of started that one. So what I'd like to do instead is just the second part of this question, which is, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? And this isn't a trick question or a right and a wrong. It gives me a sense of what you're bringing into the conversation, what you're filtering this presentation through. So I'd love in the chat bar if you could just put a couple of words down for what diversity and inclusion means to you. It will give me a really good sense, and I'll be able to kind of make a couple of comments on it. So I'd love to hear from you. So I'll just give it a moment and give you a chance to pop into the chat bar what diversity and inclusion means to you in your mind. And I'll do the awkward silence where I wait, hoping that somebody answers the question, because you never know in these kind of forums. Wow, Joe. Okay, social location awareness. Okay. I'm going to ask you more questions about that in a minute, Joe. I like the way you framed that. Same and unique altogether. Really interesting, Marie. Magda has said equal chances, respect, conscious inclusion. Oh, I love the word conscious because that's something I'll touch on in a minute. That's a really important point. Craig has said ensuring people with disabilities aren't at a disadvantage. Craig, that's so important, that Actually, it's that everybody isn't at a disadvantage, but I like that you're focusing on one of the areas that is really disadvantaged when inclusion isn't present and an understanding of diversity isn't. Michael has said being welcomed and providing opportunity to everyone, regardless of background, gender, race, etc. Yeah, you're on this. Neurodiversity, love it, Craig. That's a real area of interest to me as a neurodiverse person. Donald, another point of view. I really like that, Donald. Roddy has said a range of perspectives and everyone shares the room. I like that because you're talking to that kind of group dynamic that's important. Diversity of culture and social background. Yeah. Nurturing, welcoming, and inviting environment for all to participate. Okay. So I have a general sense, so thank you for that, of where we see this. So look, it's really topical at the moment. I'm sure you've done other things on it, or at least heard other opinions on it. So tonight, what we will do is try to deepen some of that so that we're bringing this a little bit closer to home into how this can help you. So I'm going to ask for you to think of other phrases for diversity in practice. I'm going to ask you to tell me at the end. So as we're talking through this is going to trigger different types of thoughts and ideas and connections between things, because when we think about diversity, we often think about visible diversity, a diversity I can tell that somebody is different to me. And I just like, as we walk us through this, to get a sense of other phrases for diversity in practice at the end. Okay, so I'll leave that with you as a kind of a working question. So what's this all about? Quite simply put, it's about diversity in practice. It's not about theory. So I'm using theory, but this isn't about you having more knowledge in and of itself. It's not about politics. So it's not about me pushing a diversity agenda in a particular direction. It's not about rules. So it's not about what you should and shouldn't do. It's about how you can actually practice being more inclusive. And as we walk through this, I'm hoping that you'll see that sometimes when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we end up being given training in the theory, or we end up being invited into the conversation from a political standpoint, or we end up being told what the rules are, but we don't necessarily move that to the actual practice that's important. So I'm hoping that as we work through this today, that's where we're going to come to together. So I did a poll because I like good polls on LinkedIn, since they have the feature. And I asked a question that Dr. Helen Turnbull brings up in her book, The Illusion of Inclusion. And the question is, in your experience, she believes we hire for diversity but manage for sameness. And when I asked this on LinkedIn, it was up for 3 days. I had an 89% agreement on that, and I had an 11% of people saying that's not true. So that tells me that out of 100% of engagement, 89% of people think that we intend to do something, but we don't actually practice it. That's what the managing piece is for. And so again, I want you to take that question in for a second. In your experience, do you think that your experiences of diversity and inclusion within your settings, are we actually hiring for diversity or aiming for diversity, but still managing for sameness? And that's important for you to think of for yourself, because that's going to position your experience around the reality of practicing inclusion and what diversity in actual practice looks like, rather than just in theory. So we'll build on this a little bit. So who's this for? This is primarily for leaders, both formal and informal leaders and managers, mentors and coaches, with an investment and commitment to being more inclusive in action. And I put the in action because the amount of times I get into conversations where people want to be inclusive, they just don't want to do anything differently. And this is not the talk for you if you like the notion of being inclusive, but you're not really interested in how to be. So this is really about the action piece. So who am I? I should tell you a bit about who I am so that you know where this is coming from. So I specialize in leadership development and inclusion. I've been coaching, it says 9+ years, it's actually 10+ years, across organizations, both nationally and internationally. I'm the co-designer of Diversity Beyond the Obvious, an ICF accredited program for diversity. I design and deliver leadership training programs that are tailored for organizations, and I work across multiple different industries. My approach is informed by research and practice. So I hold this kind of balance where I think about, do we have the research and evidence? And then how do we put that into practical application in the workplace? Because sometimes research doesn't necessarily, and theory doesn't necessarily translate to results in practice. So I work in between the two of those. And my background is in coaching psychology and organizational development. I've developed, and I said developing because it's an active piece, the Systemic Leadership Development Hierarchy Model. So it's a model for assessing what you need to consider in terms of your leadership development. And I'm doing PhD research into inclusive leadership. So that's the most relevant pieces of information. I didn't go back as far as every course I've ever taken, but this is where I'm coming from when I speak about this, multiple perspectives, from working with individuals to working across organizations, looking at inclusion and then looking at leadership and where they come together, having designed programs that teach coaches how to be more inclusive in their work, to tailoring programs within organizations. So I have a very particular viewpoint, and I think that's really important to name up front, because it tells you where I'm coming from when I'm speaking about this information. Because I think we need to know where people are coming from, because a lot of this stuff is systemic, and we only brought it up before the call started. And what happens is where we come from systemically informs our relationship with the topic as well. So I think it's good to know the background a little bit. Now, this is a short session, considering I could spend 3 days teaching these techniques in action with people, but this is like a running shot of this, where we're going to talk about it quite actively during the next 45 minutes to an hour. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at inclusion from a practice perspective. So I'm being really strong about that. We're going to learn the 3 techniques that support you being more inclusive straight away. These are psychologically informed techniques, and I'll explain that in a moment, why that's different to inclusion that's based around diversity agendas. We're going to understand the number 1 barrier to inclusion globally, which is a big statement, but it's a really important one. This is the edit I was meant to make. So there was a 5-day inclusive coaching piece that I was going to give you access to, but I actually literally had my team finish developing something for you today that's really special. So I'll introduce it to you later on. It's just towards the end of the presentation. And there is an invitation if you're looking to work together to get in contact. So that's what you can expect. What I do want to say is that a lot of the time when we talk about inclusion, so I'm going into environments talking about inclusion, and what we tend to do is get distracted by the topic of diversity that we're most passionate about. Okay, so when I go into a room, I might be met by people who are focused on people of color, or people who are focused on the LGBT community, or focused on disabilities. And we tend to get into diversity and inclusion because we have an investment in a particular type of diversity. And that's perfectly okay. However, what we're talking about tonight are strategies that work for absolutely everybody. So these are universal, human-based interactions that allow you to be more inclusive without necessarily being an expert on the LGBT community or diversity, or a particular diversity. So we're not going to necessarily look at one type of diversity and inclusive practices for that type of diversity. Instead, what we're looking at is inclusive practices that work across humanity, regardless of the diversity that's present. And these are kind of fundamental communication and connection techniques. So just to frame that for you, I like to call it inclusive psychology, but it doesn't really exist in psychology. But there's a lot of people working towards understanding inclusion from a psychological perspective. So that's what we're looking at today, really. That's what we're talking about. So what I'd like to know is a little bit about why you're here. So I'm going to ask you in the chat bar, and I know I'm making Donald and Sath's job really hard now, because I'm getting you to interact in the chat bar while also they catch questions. But can you tell me why you're here? And I don't need a big, deep piece, but it would be really nice to hear what you'd like to take away from the session, or what's interesting for you, or what would be beneficial for you. And while you do that, I'm going to tell you why I'm here. So very briefly, I come from a background that has a lot of intersectionality, which means that my identity crosses many different diversity sectors. And one thing that I have found is that while acceptance in one area might be really easy to attain, I may have found it really hard to find acceptance with another part of my identity that was considered diverse. And this got me thinking about some of the fundamental shared experiences that we all have about wanting to be included, and the kind of human experience desiring to belong. And so this is where my journey about 12 years ago began in this work, which was trying to understand what it is that has people include people and exclude people, and why diversity needs so much effort on behalf of people. So that's what has me here talking about it. So I'd like, again, I know I'm putting you under pressure, but in the chat, why are you here? Can you give me a sense of what it is you'd like to take away from this session. And I'm going to give you a moment to pop it into the chat and stand through the awkwardness if it's too long. Okay. Why, there's a few. Okay, so Maria said, I wasn't sure, but listening to you, I now know I'm pretty excited about learning more about this. The practice sounds great. Moonway has said, always love to learn what people have done in D&I in practical term, real use cases. Okay, brilliant. Joe, a new perspective on the topic relevant to work. Brilliant. So now I'm trying to use the chat bar as a coach. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that there is a coach on the call, because sometimes I'm like, am I talking to leaders or managers? I want to be involved in creating an environment where everyone can thrive. I really love that, Magda. And that's really what we're talking about today. Jim, to learn how I can help others better through diversity and inclusion, and the don'ts. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't know if I'll have a lot of don'ts, but my do's should be helpful. Been interested in this topic for a long time. My master's was on accessibility. That's brilliant, Craig. You'll be able to bring a lot to this. I used to blog on accessibility and now incorporate references to disability and neurodiversity. Brilliant. Oh, I don't want to skip. A better understanding of others. Just curious to know more. Brilliant, Roddy. Thank you. Diversity in another area, particular attention and skills to develop awareness. Okay. I've heard American perspectives all my life. I love that, Sheila. Even that is bringing in diversity. That's really interesting. Also, as a coach, I want to be inclusive. Okay, brilliant. So I have a sense. So we're kind of all on the same page, which is a good starting point for me. So thank you for giving me a sense. So just a couple of housekeeping things. And I'm always laughing because I know when someone tells me, put away the phone, don't be on distractions. I'm like, yeah, as I secretly type or read other things. Genuinely, it's an active session, and it would be absolutely brilliant if you could bring your focus to it. It will be short and sweet, but I am condensing information that is often taught over a 2 or 3 day period. So really, have a pen and paper or open your Word document to take notes, or have your phone to pop notes into. But I would really recommend being present for this, because it's going to bring you the value. Otherwise, I'm just telling you information. Whereas if you can interact with it, if you're aware of how you're feeling when I say things, you're aware of your reactions, you're aware of whether it's new information or not. If you're really present, you're going to have another level of learning that you can't get just by hearing new information. So look, let's talk about the proof is in the pudding. So one of the things whenever I go into organizations is whether I'm going into coach or I'm going into work on something around inclusion, it's always about the proof, right? So return on investment and things like that. So I like to start with the proof, because I think that a lot of us in this area are passion driven, which is great for us because we care about what we're doing. And at the same time, it becomes a problem in conveying a business case or a return on investment, because we think organizations and people should just be morally aligned with being inclusive. But actually, we do need a business case, because we need to balance it so that people that don't feel that that's their priority can buy in. It's a bit like, I don't want to just preach to the choir. What we want to do is bring people on a journey to understand something, and understand that diversity and inclusion is good for everybody, not just those of us that are parts of minorities. So 80% of workers indicate inclusion is important when choosing an employer. So hands down, if we're talking about engagement and attraction of key talent, it's really important, because 80% are considering it. 85% of enterprises agree that diversity results in the most innovative ideas. So we know that if you are trying to be number one in your market, we know that if you're trying to create solutions that don't already exist, that actually 85% of enterprises agree that diversity brings innovative ideas. But a bit like my earlier quote, they don't always know what to do when they bring diversity into the room, whether it's through diversity quotas, or whether it's through just attracting a really diverse workforce. They don't always know what to do with it, which is kind of where this talk is focused. Companies with inclusive practices in hiring, promotion, development, leadership, and team management generate up to 30% higher revenue per employee. And just soak that up for a second. Think about it, whether you're in a small team of 4 people or you're part of a really big organization with 4,000. When you bring inclusive practices into hiring, promotion, development, leadership, and team management, you generate 30% higher revenue per employee. That's just exceptional. And so what's important here is that it's about inclusive practices. It's not simply bringing diversity into an organization, it's knowing how to work with diversity. And for any of the coaches on the call, it's really important for you to think about this if you're promoting inclusion or diversity quotas or any of those types of changes in an organization or with an individual. you need to think about the fact that if it's not supported through practices, it doesn't actually result in measurable results. In fact, there is proof, or there is research instead of proof, because research can always be outproven, that if you just bring diversity together but you don't support it correctly, it can actually cause havoc rather than not just produce results. So, and just a little bit more, again, for those of you who are more visual, you know, it's essential for engaging and retaining today's workforce. So 80% of respondents say it's important when choosing the employer. So I've already quoted that. 39% reported that they would leave their current organisation for a more inclusive one. Also, recent stats have suggested that in the UK at the moment, that there's a risk of a 45% turnover in employee retention when COVID stabilizes. And that came from doing surveys across different organizations in different industries to see what employees were thinking about in terms of changing their jobs. And so if we were looking at these stats newer, I'm sure we'd be looking at higher stats. 23% of respondents indicated that they'd already left. So by the time they got to the survey, they'd already left their company because they weren't using inclusion. Because one of the things you have to think about is inclusion isn't just good for those in minorities. Inclusion creates psychological safety in organizations. And what that then does, and in your work with clients, when you are inclusive in your work, it creates psychological safety, which deepens any of the type of processes that you try to do with your coachees or as a leader or a manager with your staff. So look, I'm going to talk about one piece of research, and this paper, I suppose I quote because it shows us that one size doesn't fit all. It's also a paper that makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I think it's really important that when we speak about diversity and inclusion, we're not just talking about the parts we're comfortable with or that we like or that suit our agenda, but we're going beyond it. So this research paper was conducted on diversity and inclusion review with a focus on race and gender. And gender is in male and female. At the time, this is what they measured, male and females in white and black communities. So this is what they came up with. We naturally assume white men, and I need to add white able-bodied men, are able to achieve their intended goals by default. So we presume a white man will achieve his goals by default. We hold black men to a standard that they need to be less threatening first before we allow them have that default that they can achieve their goals. So they must assure us that they're less threatening. We hold white women to a standard of proving their capacity by having already achieved said outcomes and being nice in the process. So we want white women to not just say they can do something and know they can, but they have to have a track record and they have to have been nice when they did it. And this is the stat that I find most disturbing, was in this research, the researchers couldn't find a standard that we were holding black women to. It didn't even come onto our radars when we talked about leadership positions and they looked at gender and race. We didn't even expect to see them in leadership positions. And being visible and noticed was the first hurdle that they faced. And there was a hypothesis in this paper that they could possibly still face the same challenges as black men and white women. And so the reason that I say this is that if you attempt an intervention in an organization or with your coachee and you give advice that is based on your privileged position. So if I give advice that is based on me as a white woman to a man that was white, to a black man, to a woman that was black, then my position, if it's ill-informed by research, is going to be biased to my privilege. And one of the things we do when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we tend to be uncomfortable with the reality of privilege and how it alters our view of a solution. So when we hold this research, you can have the paper afterwards and have a look at it. So when we hold people at certain standards unconsciously by default, it means that they have an extra hurdle to overcome to be considered equal to anybody else. And we have white men as the natural assumption of being able to achieve their goals. Black men, white women, and black women have very different methods to equality to each other. So it's something to consider around diversity, that while we may share barriers, those barriers may not be the same barriers and the solutions may not be the same. So why inclusion matters? So I'm going to ask you all, and you don't have to put it in the chat bar, but I'm going to ask you. So I just want you to take a moment, and you can see the 2 points, but I want you to stay on the first point for a second. I want you to think about a time when you felt you belonged. So just try to find, it could be with a person or with a group, but a time when you actually felt that you belonged. And I want you to notice, when you bring that to mind, what kind of feelings or thoughts might be with you when you think of that. So a time when you belonged, how might you have felt? Beyond belonging, what did that feel like? You know, and what kind of thoughts might you have been having at the time? And did you like being there in that connection with that person or that group? So just bringing to mind one time that you felt you belonged. Now I'm going to ask you to do something that's difficult, and I'm sure it's not news because it's under this post. I'm going to ask you to transition that thought to a thought where you felt out of place, like you didn't belong. I had a lovely conversation last week, and the turn of phrase that kept coming up was out of step. So a time where you just didn't feel that they got you, that you belonged, that you were on the same page. And I want you to think about what thoughts and feelings that brought up for you about yourself, and about the situation. And even without asking you post it, I've asked this question, I think, in every diversity and inclusion piece of work I've ever done. And it's just repetitive. The types of feelings and thoughts that people have when they belong are ones that feel nourishing, supportive, replenishing. But the thoughts and feelings that come up when we think of a time where we felt out of place, raise anxiety, raise fear, raise stress, and they don't feel good. People don't want those feelings. And this is why inclusion matters, because regardless of why we might be excluded, and I'm not saying that's not important, I'm just saying our focus at the moment isn't on why we might be excluded, but the experience of exclusion. We all know what that feels like, because that has happened to most people. Some people have had that experience far more than others, and that's where privilege kicks in. But we do know what it feels like not to feel that we belonged or that we mattered in a space. We also, and I hope everyone on the call was able to connect to a time where they felt that they belonged. And when you know the impact it has on you, you can see why it matters. So yes, there's the return on investment, but why it really matters is that human beings work better, they thrive better, they feel better when they feel that they belong. Whereas when they feel out of place, their defenses kick in. They become more restricted in some way, or they withdraw, or they minimize, or they dominate, or they attack. Like, our defenses kick in when we don't feel that we belong. And so we don't function or thrive from that space. And that's why, at a very humanistic level, inclusion really matters, is because we function better when we feel that we belong than when we don't. So I'm going to skip that piece for a second. So the three techniques that we're going to talk about tonight is we're going to talk about how you discuss diversity with another without projecting assumptions, stereotypes onto them. This one's a good one because whenever I teach this one, I make the very mistake of what I'm trying not to do. So I'll talk you through that in a second. The second one we're going to look at is how you can understand cognitive bias influences our interactions with others and what to do about it. So there's lots of talk about unconscious and conscious bias, but we're actually going to talk about what you can do with it when it occurs. And then the third one is using a psychological perspective to engage with people in a more inclusive way. Okay, so three of these techniques come from a psychological perspective, but we're going to start with the very first one. So the very first one is discuss diversity with another without projecting assumptions or stereotypes onto them. This is one of those goals that we never fully achieve, but the practice of aiming for them makes us naturally more inclusive. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, I mean by learning to open up conversations that aren't naturally closing something. So opening up with a universal question for everyone. So this is a question that I felt was really strong from working with leaders and coaches that works across both settings. And it is to ask people, is there anything you would like me to know that would allow me to support you more effectively? Now, it sounds really simple, but what we've done here is we haven't required somebody to out themselves, whether it's a disability or their sexuality or something else that's different about them that they may not feel ready to give. But what we have done is said, we're here to hear something that we may not know about you. I'm aware there's something I may not know about you that you want me to know so that I can support you more effectively. And this question, so I did this talk, and Donald was on this talk a while back, and I got some feedback about 2 months after, and people said it had really done two things. The two coaches who got on to me said that it really helped them start opening their relationships with coachees in a much less threatening way, but also a much more neutral way. And they were getting more information in their first meeting with a coachee than they were previously. And then the second piece of feedback I got was actually from a senior manager, a senior manager. And they said that they started to use this question when they met a team member for the first time, that actually they opened with this question. And what had happened was the first time that they opened with it, the person said, no, there's nothing I need to tell you. And about 3 weeks later, the staff member came back and disclosed a disability to them. And it was only because they knew there was an invitation that at the time they were then in a position to open it and offer it. So that's one kind of universal question. But more importantly, the components under that question lie in neutrality. And the types of questions you can ask using neutral language are things like, what holidays do you celebrate? Rather than, like in Ireland, a really typical thing is we presume everybody does Christmas. And we only presume that because of the Catholic Church's role in our country's development, but also because for a long time, other religions weren't even taught in schools. So we presumed everyone had a Christmas holiday. But now, as we see loads more fantastic cultural diversity showing up in the country and places of worship that go beyond Catholicism and Christianity, and we see that people have different holidays, it's now a really nice question to change to, instead of saying, what are you doing for Christmas? You say, what holidays do you celebrate? To learn more about a person. The other one is to use the word partner rather than boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband. Because when you use the word partner, you allow somebody to not have to come out to you unless they want to. And when you put a gender on that partner, you put someone in a position of having to decide, do I out myself to you, or do I let you believe in the gender you've given my partner? And that creates a tension for somebody because they're different to you and you've assumed that they're the same. The other one here is, what is their name? And for this one, it's their. So not his, not hers, but their name. Whenever you can use neutral language like that, you allow people, you signal a safety to them that you're not expecting a certain gender based on whatever your expectation is, but you're also signaling to them that you're willing to be educated because you're using neutral language. The other one is, how old are your kids? Somebody corrected this in the last one, which was really funny. They're like, or how old are those kids, instead of presuming the person owns the kids, which I thought was actually owns the kids is a terrible phrase, but which I think is a really good way of doing it, which is, how old are the kids? But the purpose of saying how old are the kids is instead of saying how old is he or she and presuming it. The other variation to that is, instead of saying where are your mommy or daddy or where are your parents, because not all kids are with their parents, it's asking questions like, where are your grown-ups? Because we all know what the person means, but we aren't highlighting something that may not be available to somebody. And then the next one is, do you celebrate X, Y, and Z? So instead of Christmas, like I said, you can use language like, do you celebrate Christmas, instead of presuming it as the default position. So really, this isn't like the perfect set of questions, but what this is getting you to think about is how you neutralize your language when you're asking people questions or trying to get to know them, so that you can signal to them that it's safe for them to offer as much or as little as they want to, but also to not need to correct you if you've misunderstood them by projecting something onto them. So I'm going to grab it. I did that the wrong way around. That's hilarious. I was thinking that. Okay. So before I move on to that one, I'm just going to take a drink. And what I'd love to see, and I know you have comments, I can't read the chat while I'm walking us through this, but oh, brilliant. I can see the first one. I can see seeing it for ages, not if it's a dialectal thing. It could be actually, Craig, that's a really good point. So there's some phrases that would be culturally or dialectally just aligned, and then there'll be other phrases that aren't. We use a phrase in Ireland, and I don't know if it's used in the UK, but it's lads. So I would say, okay, lads, what's the crack? And it wouldn't matter if it's a woman or a man or a child, but it actually does create an expectation of what I'm expecting of people, because what are their connotations of the word lads? So what I'm going to ask you to do in the chat bar while I take a drink and give you a moment to reflect, because this is the point, what does it mean to you? What other questions or ways do you think you could neutralize language so that you could be more inclusive in how you ask questions? Now, you can do two things. You can think about it from your perspective of when people ask you questions that you can see the projections in, or B, you could think about a time somebody corrected you or you were corrected by a situation. So have a think. I'm going to take a drink, give you a moment or two. But what other kind of language or questions could you use that might be more inclusive than what we currently use? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that? Oh, I like that. People, yeah, group, everyone. Okay, yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah, guys, and that's a cultural thing, but it does create a unconscious standard of some sort, like bro culture. Hey everyone, yeah, and Joe, it's funny because like I'm really strong about this, and at the same time, I catch myself all the time doing it wrong. I use folks quite often. Yeah, I think folks is quite neutral. In Ireland, I use folks as about my parents. So folks means I'm talking about my parents. So that's funny to see the differences. But y'all, yeah, that's very, and team, yeah, they're very neutral. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So basically what I'm inviting you to do now, the practice is learning to think about what's neutral. Okay. So that you can actually bring it into how you're talking to people. So the second one is to understand how cognitive bias influences our interactions with others and what to do about it. So I'm sure you've all heard about like unconscious bias, conscious bias. It gets talked about a lot, but often what isn't understood is why it's there. Okay, so our unconscious bias is a way of us, or our bias full stop, is a way of us quickly sorting people into sections so that we can decide whether they're a threat or not. It's very, very historical to the human experience. It's part of how our brain makes sense of threats or not threats, okay? And so we all do this. This is why inclusion is a practice, but exclusion just happens naturally. We don't have to work very hard to be exclusionary to people, but we have to work really hard to be inclusive, which is why there's so much difficulty around developing inclusive practices, because actually it takes us to be cognitively focused and committed. Now, what it basically does, very simply, is we have beliefs about certain things. When we see something that may trigger that belief, we get stuck in the green part. So I'm going to give you an example. If you have a belief that women or men are a certain way, and then you meet a man or a woman, which is the objective fact, that objective fact, which is that you've met a man or a woman, meets with the belief you have about it, which results in your cognitive bias. And it could be unconscious, so you might not even know you have it, or it could be very conscious and you could validate it and think, you know, that is what's wrong with women, or that is what's wrong with men. But so very simply, we have it for safety reasons, so there's no need to shame ourselves. It's naturally there. Everybody naturally has that, but if we want to be inclusive, we have to work on it. And this is how we do it in a very simple 3-step process. First is we acknowledge our reactions as ours. So I'm going to just pretend I'm talking about women. So if I have a belief about women, and then I interact with a woman and I have this belief and I see that it's proving my belief true, then I have to acknowledge that actually a part of me already believed that before I was interacting with that person. Okay, so I have to first start by acknowledging it's there, because if I don't acknowledge it, I can't go any further. The second is I need to get curious about the other person. So instead of trusting the section I've sorted them into with all of the labels and beliefs that I'm semi-conscious of, I have to instead get curious about the person to understand them. So I have to start being curious about why they said that, rather than concluding why they said that in my head. I have to be curious about why they see the world that way and not the way I do, rather than judging why they see the world that way. And then the third thing I have to do is discern our conclusions. So I've got to be willing to challenge my own belief systems and preferences. And how you do that is, after you get curious, you then bring that new information and you ask yourself if the original bias or the original belief is actually supported by this behavior, or if I'm actually ignoring other pieces of information because I want to reinforce my bias. Because remember, as human beings, we want to be right. It's just built into us. We like to think we're right. So when we have an unconscious or a conscious bias, we still want it to be right, even though it's a bias, even though it doesn't help us be inclusive. We would still rather be right than be wrong. So we have to be able to move to that space where, after the curiosity, we're willing to be wrong if our original bias was incorrect. The other thing there's a terrible bias that we all have where we will look for proof that what we believe is right is right. So if we're going to really work through our bias, this curiosity in the center is really, really important, because if we're not really curious about the situation, what we're actually going to do is kick into a situation where we're just going to say, yeah, well, I was curious, but they're still this way for this reason. And we're not going to discern our conclusions. So that 3-step process is absolutely essential. But again, it's a practice. It's not something that will come naturally. You'll have your beliefs, you'll believe your beliefs, and then you need to move yourself through a process like this to be able to come out the other end where the bias isn't controlling you, but instead you're understanding how your bias could limit the situation or your insights or the information that you take in. So that's the 3 steps that you need around your cognitive bias. The third one is to use a psychological perspective to engage with people in a more inclusive way. This one is, I like this one. I think this is kind of sexy, right? So cognitive dissonance, for anybody who doesn't know what it means, in simplest terms, it involves conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So for instance, if I have a belief, best one I can give you, if I have a belief that my nephew would never do that, whatever that is, and then I get a call from somebody to say, well, your nephew did that, and it's just not possible that my nephew did that. And then I have to take in new information. We'll say it's about my nephew hitting someone. And then I have to take in this new information that this beautiful, innocent 5-year-old is actually not as innocent as I thought, and is actually willing to hit someone. Well, what happens is we get physically uncomfortable when we get information that conflicts with our attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. And what we tend to do is reject the new information. It's often how brainwashing occurs. It's a lot about if, when people become paranoid. Cognitive dissonance is that space where if we take in this new information, it's going to challenge our current beliefs and it makes us physically uncomfortable. So it produces a feeling of mental discomfort where we alter to an alteration in one of our attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors so that we can reduce the discomfort and restore balance. So an example would be this. If you were taught really strongly about a religious something, and you later found that that wasn't true or wasn't aligned, you may find yourself having a really deeply uncomfortable process before you can accept the new information as true. And this happens in families all the time. This happens in group settings all the time. This happens in organizations, and it happens in our own heads. And the thing is that if you don't understand that cognitive dissonance is occurring when you learn new information, then you're not going to actually stay with the new information. You're going to restrict it, reject it, and limit it because of how uncomfortable it actually is. And so again, another simple 3-step process. And this one is a little simpler than the last one. The first is to notice, like, if you think about a time where you found out new information that you really didn't like to hear, that made you really uncomfortable, it changes something in your body because it feels very threatening. So the starting point is to take notice of the fact that there is some cognitive dissonance and that it feels uncomfortable. The second part is to acknowledge the components that were involved in it. So think about how this came to be. What is it that I believed previously? What is it that the new information is bringing up in me? And how does that feel? And then the third one is to wait. So cognitive dissonance can actually resolve itself when you give it space and time, as long as you're not rejecting the new information. So you're giving yourself the space and time to integrate it and to come up with a new conclusion. What a lot of us want to do through the anxiety that comes up with it is get away from it very quickly, shut down the other person, prove our point, move on. But if we can sit with and wait, we allow that cognitive dissonance to occur, we acknowledge it to ourselves, we acknowledge why it's occurring, and we don't try to fix it, we'll actually come to a much stronger conclusion afterwards that will have been integrated, but we have to wait it out. But our system naturally wants us to move on with it very quickly. So here are the 3 diversity in practice methods that we've talked about. So open questions and neutral language, to acknowledge bias and to discern, and cognitive dissonance, and wait. And the waiting is the really important part. So they're the 3 practices. So what I'm going to ask for you to do before we go a step further is, out of those 3, and I know I've gone through them quickly, I just don't know how else I can introduce that many of them when I could spend 3 days training in them. Which one of those 3 do you think would be most beneficial to you to practice over the next 2 weeks. So either the first, second, or third, and just use the numbers in the chat so that I can get a sense of what's resonating with you. Okay, so we have a 3. Oh, brilliant. I'm glad explaining cognitive dissonance made sense. It's actually a really hard experience to have. I'm getting quite a few 3s. Yeah. So here's, right, I'm going to give you an insight. It won't be a secret once I tell you on a recording, but here's a good one. I often work with people who are really strong in one area of diversity, right? So they're really, really strong in a particular belief system. And what happens is that they learn new information. So I'm going to give you an example. So protesting for Black Lives Matter, big group of people went out protesting. And during the protest, there was a particular group of people who were religious. And they were like, inclusion, equal rights, everything matters. And then when it came up about LGBT matters, they said, no, not those people though, not them, because they're like ungodly, and they had a list of reasons why. And the thing is that in that moment, there was this cognitive dissonance that was happening because they believed in and were advocating for inclusion, but they couldn't see how the LGBT experience was part of that inclusion. And yet they said everyone had the right to be included. And they were having this real challenge with absorbing that because it contradicted a really deeply held belief system. And now, one of the places that I think is important around cognitive dissonance to keep in mind is it's not about deciding what's right and wrong for everybody else. It's about understanding why something is so uncomfortable for you and whether that is an inherent exclusionary belief that you have, or whether it's something that is part of how you want to view the world. So it's allowing yourself to be open to the fact that actually other people's beliefs do cause us a lot of pain. When we feel excluded in some way or we feel unseen, but equally we do that to each other all the time. And I see that within like diversity and inclusion movements all the time, is that we tend to fight for one type of diversity and then we struggle with making sense of the other type. And I know that when I talk to people who have intersectional identities, they say that comes up quite a bit for them. So I'm really glad to hear a couple of them there, that you're taking a couple away. So let's think about this. So what gets in the way of including difference? So you tell me in the chat bar again, you're good for using the chat, so I'm delighted. What do you think actually gets in the way of including differences? What is it that happens to us that gets in the way, in your opinion? Fear. Brilliant, Jim. Spot on. That's definitely a big one. Yeah. Michael, bias. Yeah. Yes, Joe, that self-centric piece. It's so true. It's a bit like that story I was telling you about protesting for Black Lives Matter. And because that mattered to some of the people that was the lived experience of some of the people protesting, they could totally understand why inclusion was important for that. But because they didn't have the experience of being LGBT, they couldn't. Magda, laziness, not recognizing the problem, like that religious example. Yeah. So there's often a systemic background to why we're not inclusive, and we are blind to it. So we all have a systemic background that we're not aware of. So we may be aware of the systemic piece, but it will create biases in us that are unconscious that will limit us in some way. Michael says education. Michael, that's really interesting. There's research in suggesting that education was kind of the approach originally for diversity and inclusion, but they found that educating people doesn't necessarily lead to any changes in inclusion. It just gives people new information. So there's this kind of question about what education is limiting people. Seth, I think that's brilliant. That's cultural conditioning. I think that's a really big piece. So I'm going to tell you what is the number one, and that I feel is the number one, based on my work, and your comments will be interesting. Our power sources. Okay, I use the Power Rangers. I was asked, did I really want to use the Power Rangers, but I thought I liked the image, and I loved the Power Rangers as a kid. So basically, a lot of the time when we talk about inclusion, we are actually talking about sharing power. That's what it boils down to. We are talking about sharing power equally, and we're talking about sharing power in the interest of the people involved in the group, not only the mainstream people or the in-group, but everybody. And one of the really big challenges about inclusion work is, and this comes up in the conversations all the time, like diversity quotas is an example. It's this notion that when we talk about privilege, that we're asking people with privilege, and we all have different privilege, but we're asking people with privilege to give that up to those that are underprivileged. And that goes against everything connected to capitalism, everything connected to our personal power sources, the notion that you would give up power to people you don't know, don't necessarily have a relationship with, don't necessarily know the consequences of, creates a really big challenge for us. So it creates challenges on individual levels, like between people in companies or in groups. It also, there's another layer, which is, what if I'm working with someone who's very different to me? Am I willing, as the professional in the room, as the coach, am I willing to say, I don't know a lot about that tradition, can you tell me more? Am I willing to be a novice in a position that I naturally have an inherent power? Am I willing to share the power in a room and neutralize it? And then there's the global stuff. Look at all the things that go on around land and borders, which is all about power. And so one of the big things that gets in the way is that when we don't know where we're sourcing our power from, do I source my power from being a woman? Do I source my power from being white? Do I even know that being a woman gives me a certain type of power, being white gives me another type of power? Do people who don't have barriers to some of those powers, do they know that they don't? So as a member of the neurodiverse community, I know that people who are neurotypical have an advantage naturally in society, have a privilege I don't, but they don't necessarily know that. So when I go knocking on the door and say, come here, share your power with me, you need to diversify how you hire people and how you rate people and how you grade people. And they say, why are you giving me all that extra work so that you can have access? So what happens is it boils down to power struggles. And I think that if we can understand that, then when we talk about diversity and inclusion and we practice these things, we can bring an awareness to the fact that we're trying to share power in an effort to create better outcomes for everyone. But equally, that is really, really challenging for human beings to do. And that's why we see all of the challenges that we see. And so this is the freebie. And look, I'm going to ask for some forgiveness on this one. This is an assessment that I've been building for a while. You're the first people to get access to it. You can get it there, silewalsh.com/inclusive-assessment. The piece of forgiveness I'm going to ask is, you may get an email automated afterwards that has nothing to do with it, because I can't seem to fix the tech in time when I got on this call, but you will still get the results straight away. And the assessment's actually really good because it's looking at psychologically inclusive, how psychologically inclusive you really are, rather than how inclusive are you of certain diversities. Okay, so I'd really love for you to pop over, do the test, get your results. Let me know what you think of it if you want any further feedback or anything like that. And forgive me if that tech isn't finished yet. I don't think it is. I tried, but I'm not sure. The second thing is, if after speaking, you're interested in booking a free consultation to kind of discuss inclusion and development goals and kind of your next steps, you can pop over again my website, and it's just --free consultation, like hyphen between the words. So you can pop on there. It's kind of first come, first serve, but there's a calendar so you can pick what you'd like to do. So just before we get to the Q&A, I just want to recap briefly what we've done. So we've looked at inclusion from a practical perspective. We have learned 3 techniques that support you to be more inclusive straight away. Now, here's the thing. Learning them tonight won't make you more inclusive. It's doing them tomorrow or doing them during, from after this call onwards is what will help you be more inclusive. We've also discussed the number 1 barrier to inclusion globally, and it's really important because it is the fundamental barrier that when you go down an inclusion journey, you will hit against. Hit against as a person, hit against as a team, but you'll hit against within an organization as well. You have access to the inclusive assessment, and you've been invited to work together if you want to do that free consultation. So that's what we've done today. So what I'm going to move on to now is the Q&A, and I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay, and just see. I don't know if Donald or Seth have brought up any questions in the meantime.
There was nothing in the chat, but it's a small group, Sheila. So we have a small group. We're usually quite happy to let folk just chip in, and happy to unmute, or if you want to stick your hand up, I'll lead you in, so to speak. Yeah, it's a small group, so we can keep it pretty chill.
Maru did have his hand up early on in the session.
Early on he did, yeah.
Is it still relevant?
Maru, did you had your hand up earlier?
Yeah.
You want to chip in with your... comment,
I-
question,
I
observation?
honestly completely forgot what it was about. I'm a very visual guy, so I need the slide as an anchor, but I'm sure it was nothing life-changing. So
No worries, man. So yeah, go Jim.
Jim.
Yeah, no, I can see you.
Can I take some of the time to say how much I enjoyed the session? Really, I appreciate it, Sile.
That's
Thanks,
it.
Marie.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Is
Jim,
it-
go on, hit us with a question. I'd love one.
Sure. Sorry, can I just check pronunciation of your name?
Oh, I love the question. It's Sheila. It's
Sheila.
Sheila. Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad I asked then, Sheila.
No, Marie. Don't. So here's the thing on the name thing. I actually don't care what I'm called. It's like it's the least important thing to me. But I've had to learn to ask people their names because even on a good day, I can't pronounce someone else's name correctly. Like I think I've called Seth 3 times already, and I'm like, it's Seth. Stop adding the E instead of the A. So there's no issue.
Happens all the time. I've also got used to it, and I don't massively care.
Yeah.
Well, I'm originally
Sorry,
from
Jim.
Glasgow. I'm originally from Glasgow, where everyone's called Jimmy, even the women. So it was interesting hearing throughout your presentation, you mentioned about the practice being the important thing, and I get that. And it made me think that I'm sure for a lot of us, it resonated because I'm in the kind of continuous improvement space. I work with kind of lean and I guess to a certain extent agile. So a lot of these transformations and improvement attempts fail for a whole variety of reasons. And I've actually got a fantastic book here that I read recently that goes into some explanations of why the author has experienced these things over their career. A lot of it to do with leadership and management. So in that respect of it resonating, what's your perspective on why this fails? Is it any different from why other transformations fail? Or is it just the same thing again, i.e. leadership and management often think this is for the workers to deal with, and it's not something that they have to take responsibility for? That's one that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, Jim, a really great question. Yes and no, because apparently I can never pick a side. So it's similar in the sense that change processes are really challenging. Okay, so like hands down, change processes are really challenging. The way we attempt to create change is a big issue. So I come from I'm coming from the psychology of what motivates people, how you how people engage with change readiness. That's where I think a lot of the time I get brought in because people have been told they're going to change. And I don't even mean in inclusion work. I mean, my leadership work, the poor leader gets handed to me and they think, who's your one and why am I being handed to her? They just get told. I think that our approach to change within organizations needs to mature. We need to realize that change happens with people and not to people. So on that level, yes. But there's another level to inclusion that is beyond that, which is a lot of people think inclusion is about being nice. And actually, sometimes inclusion isn't about being nice. It's about being active and including people, but that doesn't mean that we're being nice. So a lot of the time people think, well, I'm not mean to anyone, so it's not me. So we have this notion that we are inclusive, we're not the problem, they are. And it comes up in diversity and inclusion research all the time, which is we always think other people need to change. We blame managers, we blame leaders, we blame our colleagues, but we don't necessarily always say, what's my role in inclusion and how am I not being inclusive? Every one of us is naturally exclusive. So this is where it's a little different to other issues. Some people will buy in, like on the change curve, will buy into change. Every one of us are naturally exclusive, regardless of your background, your race, your gender. We are born with the ability to exclude people, to look for our in-group, to find people similar to us. But when it comes to inclusion, we think it's about being nicer to people, and we think other people need to do more work than us on it. And so we have a bias that actually our work, we ourselves are not as responsible. And so I think that has another layer to it, because we're actually talking about, like, I compare it to pooping in a toilet. I know it's not a very mature example, right? But we used to poop in toilets. We used to poop on ourselves. Then we used to poop in forests. Then we learned that actually you could poop in a hole. And then we learned you could poop in a toilet. And now we have bidets, right? And people can squirt their butts with water. And that's now like the civilization process of pooping, which is very instinctive, very natural. I think inclusion is the same. We start over here slightly exclusive. We say, okay, well, we probably don't have to like poop on ourselves anymore. I don't have to say all those terrible things about myself because of my race or my gender or something. Let me mature it a little bit. But I don't think we're near the bidet yet. But unfortunately, our organizations need us to be at the bidet stage because they're growing faster and we're becoming more multiculturalism than we can keep up with if we don't mature ourselves. So I see it a little bit like an evolutionary thing, not just a change process. And I know I'm going to have to come up with a way better analogy than pooping because it, like some audiences, it doesn't go down well with, but I can't think of something that's so natural that we've matured, because I think that's what we need to do with inclusive work. It's natural for us not to be, but we can't evolve into, and we can't keep up with the pace of the world and globalization we won't keep up with our workplaces if we don't start getting nearer the bidet. So I think there's the two layers. Sorry, that's a really long one, but this is the stuff I'm really passionate about. So there's the change stuff that we all challenged with, and then there's the evolutionary human experience. So I think it has a slightly double-edged sword. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, great insight to that. Thanks very much.
I was going to say, as far as analogies goes in terms of evolution, I mean, it's really one that we can all relate to. So you would hope it would work, right?
Yeah, I used to do it. In Ireland, it's okay to swear. I've learned that in some cultures, it's really insulting. So I use different language sometimes, depending on the audience. But I realized recently, it's like, that's really crude. It doesn't land the same when I start dropping the S word. So I was like, okay, I'll have to use the word poop like I'm talking to a child. But it is a very basic evolution that we didn't actually need to do, but we chose to do it. But the difference is we do need to do inclusion work because we won't be able to succeed in organizations or in the world if we don't. So there's a more pressing need for that than having a bidet, really. So I'll stick with it for now until someone gives me a better one. So if anyone here gets a better one, send it to me. I'd love to.
I think it works. Sheila's patiently had her hand up, so I'm going to hand over to Sheila. So Sheila's got a good question for you. Sheila always has a good question.
Well, I was looking at the presentation and the focus is on Black versus white. And I'm very concerned about that because that doesn't take into account all the people that don't fall into either of those categories or that are multiracial. So I think it's still the presentation and probably the research on it isn't inclusive enough. I was very offended when I heard one of the founders of Black Lives Matter speak, because she was saying that white women should go speak to their white friends about race. And that's kind of a racist thing to say. So, and that's a problem I have with Black Lives Matter in general, is the whole, it's not just black and white, it's brown and yellow and how we define, and I have several friends that are multiracial. And I don't think that when we're talking about diversity, I don't think that's being taken into account. And it sounds like that must be happening worldwide, because that was one of the things I was curious about, was whether the European perspective would be any different than the American perspective on that. Because in some parts of the US, the people that get the most difficulty are either people who are Hispanic or people who are American Indians.
Yeah. So I don't actually focus on race. That was an example of intersectionality between race and gender. So I had to pick a study that showed two things together. I wouldn't be an expert on race, although it's an area that I've looked into a good bit. I wouldn't position myself as an expert. I think Sheila, you're pointing to the challenges that come up when we have conversations about diversity, and we can become polarized in the conversations. And in that research situation, they researched a very specific thing. In research, you have to research a very specific thing to get it over the line in academia, to get it passed and peer reviewed. But I think that one of the challenges is that, like, the piece that you're saying about race is really interesting, because I have family in the States, and I do think that there's a slightly different experience, and there's definitely a different experience of race in Ireland. Not that it's any less racist, but its presentation and symptoms are different, even to the UK. When I lived in the UK versus when I visit the States, they have different experiences. But I think the systemic piece is sometimes harder to capture. And it's interesting about the suggestion that white women should speak to their white friends. I've heard that. I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't necessarily think that's enough either. I suppose there are people
that
beyond
excludes a
white
huge
and
number of my friends. If I only speak to my, even if I only speak to my white friends, like one of my friends who was a blue-eyed blonde, very fair complected, her mother was Anglo-Indian and her father was African-American. She just came out looking like that. So everyone would assume she was someone with white privilege. But that was not the background she came from. That was not her cultural identity. And that's true of an awful lot of people today.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a difference between race and cultural identity, and then there's also the history of where, let me phrase it correctly, the notion of black and white came from is actually, like, it's lodged in history. It actually had nothing to do with culture and everything to do with capitalism. So I think that one of the challenges is that when we're talking about something that was built historically, it doesn't always reflect the context that we're speaking about it now in. And I think people get left behind in the conversation. I know I had to do an awful lot of work about understanding the history of why white people are called Caucasian, when actually, like, there's only a very small proportion of Caucasians in the world. And it's, but look, I think our job is, if there's something that's creating discomfort for us, I think that if we're trying to be inclusive, we become curious about it and bring ourselves maybe into conversations we're not as comfortable having, so that we can see if our perspective is actually limited by our privilege, if it's limited by the people we're speaking to, and so we can expand ourselves to being more inclusive. So I don't believe in taking a right or wrong position, but instead saying, if we're uncomfortable with something, that's cognitive dissonance, if there's a part of us that's like, that doesn't sit with me, then instead of just agreeing with it and looking for proof for it, I would suggest for the inclusive piece that we start to get really curious about our reaction and really curious about other people's reaction. Why do they see it so differently? Because I think it's in that we learn to include different perspectives and understand things differently. I don't think it's as clean as a right and wrong, but there is a historic reason that they're speaking about black and white. There is like a legislative reason that that's the conversation. But yeah, but there is massive intersectionality, not just gender. So you've got gender, you've got race, you've got ability. Like there's so many intersectionalities where a person isn't just.
Well, you also didn't mention introverts versus extroverts, which is another one where introverts often don't get heard.
Yeah. So in terms of, I didn't list out the majority of different versions of diversity, because I wouldn't have had it, I wouldn't have got through it in an hour. Yeah, but the practices that I listed are good for everybody, regardless of their labels. And I think that's what I was trying to hold us closely to, is that actually I don't know every label. I don't know every label's need. And then I also don't know what every individual with that label would prefer. I call them, do, understand. But what I do know is that on a humanistic level, there are practices that we can do that are more inclusive than maybe ones we do by default. And that was kind of the focus, because I couldn't, like Sheila, I couldn't list off everything. So I appreciate there's loads of things, there's things on that aren't on that list that I identify as, but it wasn't about I couldn't get a list of the diversity I'd be listing all day. It was about bringing us to thinking about how we can be more inclusive. So I really appreciate your point. I think it raises some really good questions for everyone. Yeah, generational, like intergenerational working environments is a big thing now. And like, I literally couldn't list off all of them, but they're existing. There's so many differences to the human experience, and they intersect and they change what it means for different people. And so we've got to think about not just, oh, this person is like, Sheila is white and therefore this is her lived experience. We've got to think about Sheila and what Sheila would like us to consider as her lived experience. And that requires us to be more curious rather than our natural default of positioning everyone, which we just do in our psyche. So brilliant point, Sheila. So thank you for bringing up that, because I think you've alliterated like really well. Thank you.
I didn't see any other hands up. I don't know if there's any other. I've still got 10 minutes.
Well, and I can talk some more. I have another comment.
Yeah, come on then.
I have a problem with the saying that you have to step back from privilege, because who decide, the being inclusive is one thing, but I think I heard something about privilege somewhere in the presentation, and that's something that I keep hearing. And who decides that someone was privileged? And what does that mean? And how does that really reflect on where you go with the conversation? I think that might be another thing where the perception of privilege, that's what I was talking about with the friend that people would perceive as white, but that was not her personal experience. But they would assume, oh, she's a natural platinum blonde, therefore must be privileged. But that's not where she came from ethnically or culturally, or, in terms of class.
Well, class, like just on that, Sheila, class is one of the biggest issues in diversity and inclusion. It's alongside that, there's other things, but it's one of these really big ones that scans across the globe with different terms, but it scans across the globe. I think so. Privilege often creates massive resistance in people, right? And I used to be one of those people. So I really get it. And sometimes it makes me cringe still. When I talk about privilege, what I'm suggesting is that sometimes I have easier access to things than other people. And until I see someone without that access, I don't know it's a privilege. So the people who tend to know somebody has a privilege are those without it. It's those people who tend to see it because they don't have it. A privilege, in my mind, isn't that we should give it up. It's that we should make room for others to have access to that privilege too. So I don't believe that it's about lowering something. I actually think it's about creating more room. So a very brief example is, if I walk to the shop, and I've walked to the shop where I live like every day, twice a day, depending on like what chocolate I want, for 2 years now, I never knew that a wheelchair didn't fit on that footpath. I never knew that a neighbor who's in a wheelchair can't access the shop I can access. I didn't know that for 2 years. And then I was like, oh, that's the privilege I have as an able-bodied person who can access it. It's not that I'm bad. It's not that I've done something wrong. It's that I don't have a barrier or a hurdle that this person has. And when I see that we're not going to have access in the same way. And so then that's what I see privilege is that I don't have the hurdle someone else has. It's not necessarily something I should be shamed for or feel bad for, but I do take into account, to be inclusive, I have to take into account that I presumed my neighbor went to the shop like I did. And now they don't, and now I know they don't. And now I realize I have privilege to be able to access something that they by right should be able to access and don't. And so that was a privilege that I wasn't aware I had until I witnessed that they couldn't access that shop. So for me, it depends how privilege is used. Sometimes it's used to shut people down, and I don't think that's inclusive. But I do think that it's a really healthy practice to think about, where do I have access and where don't I have barriers that other people do? And that's how I view it personally. I'm not the person who goes around telling people who has privilege and who doesn't. Again, this isn't about rules. For me, people on this call want to be inclusive. So I'm inviting you to consider how you may have privilege that naturally gives you a perspective that isn't as inclusive as it could be. So if I couldn't get to that shop because I couldn't walk on that footpath, I'd have complained to the council by now. But because I could get to the shop and because I didn't know that someone else couldn't, I didn't complain to the council about it. So it's just learning that I had access to something someone else didn't, which was a privilege.
Yeah, one of my friends was in not a wheelchair. She was using some kind of a scooter to get around for a while. And she said half of the ramps that are there for handicapped people, at least in the US, are completely useless. They're there for cosmetic reasons, but they're not useful. So just because there's a ramp doesn't mean that it's actually accessible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think I do actually have a YouTube video where I think I speak for about 10 minutes explaining the breakdown of how I've worked with privilege and help other people to understand privilege. If you were really interested, because I don't come from the position of where we should shame or blame, but I do come from the position, if you want to be inclusive, knowing your privilege is really valuable in being genuinely inclusive. But that isn't necessarily an easy thing to do if it's a natural experience you've always had. Like I've always had the natural experience of getting into that shop. So I never considered that someone else couldn't get their groceries from that shop. So it's just about thinking differently or bigger than our experience, going beyond ourselves.
The other one that I thought about in the workplace is you talked about when someone new starts, and if you ask them, is there anything I should know about you? One of my friends had had a brain tumor, and she said, now in the US, when you apply for a job, there's something you have to fill out about things like handicaps. That's to capture information. It's supposed to be completely confidential, and not even HR has access to the detail of it. But she said she would never put down that she had a disability on that form because she felt it would be used against her. And at the same time, she probably would not be comfortable saying anything to a manager, even if they asked that question. Now, if you're trying to be inclusive, but there are people that are so nervous that it's going to be held against them that they won't put it down, they won't tell you. How do you get past that? Because I think that's one of the challenges that people aren't even realizing is there.
So being inclusive doesn't mean that people will or have to disclose to us, but it means that we create a space where we allow people, if they choose to safely disclose to us, to know that we're a safe person. So inclusion isn't that we disclose. There's loads of things I don't disclose to people about myself because I don't want to. And I have the autonomy to do that. But when somebody opens something inclusively, it allows me to know that it would be safe to, if I felt comfortable or wanted to. And so inclusion isn't about people outing themselves to us in any form. It's more about us creating a space where we don't presume that there's not something they may need us to know.
No, what I think I'm saying is more about the forms that people go through the formal appearance of inclusion, but the corporate culture isn't inclusive. And therefore the person still doesn't feel safe in that culture. And that, I think, is a much bigger challenge than the individual.
Yeah, so look, it's like inclusive organizations are fundamental. That would be a lot more than an hour's workshop. That's a really massive piece of work. But even outside of that, I've worked in environments, organizations that weren't inclusive. I can still be inclusive in my practices that let people know I'm a safe person. Even if they choose not to do anything, I can still do my piece, even if the organization isn't going there. But that's a tension. That's the reality, isn't it, of this work? There's always tensions between the invitation to be out in some way, and then the safety if you are out within the organization in some way. That's always a tension that exists with diversity and inclusion. Yeah. I see people are signing off.
Yeah, it's folk have got dinner and other things, and it's we've got 6 minutes left, so it's maybe time for one last final question from someone other than Sheila. Thanks, Sheila.
Sheila, we could talk all night, I'd say. So
no, Sheila always brings a good perspective to these sessions. Is there anything from anyone else? We'll wrap it up, folks. A few minutes. Any last burning questions?
Craig has said something really good in the comments there. You can use anonymous feedback. That can be really helpful. Because sometimes people don't feel safe. I know that I've had to call out incidences that I witnessed occur to other people because it wasn't safe for them to call it out because they already had the discrimination that was against them. So if they called it out, that they'd be highlighting something that could unconsciously work against them. And then equally, they had the incident that was discriminating. So anonymous feedback can be really helpful because it can protect people, in terms of disclosure.
Yeah. No, we've talked about psychological safety for quite a while now, and I think that's, and again, I'm not a fan when people, kind of use it that explicitly, say, "Oh, look, this is a safe space," because as soon as you've called it out, it's probably not a safe space, right?
Yeah. I love it. Logan just popped something in there, Seth, which was interesting to hear more about people's sources of power and how we work with that. Yeah, that's a really big piece. That's why I kind of only pointed to it. But actually, I think it's probably one of the most valuable pieces to understand is where we're sourcing our power from as people and unconsciously, systemically. So if we can understand that, it positions us to see this conversation, I think, from a more I was going to say inclusive, but that's not the word, but like a more bird's eye view. So you don't just see your part of the situation, but you're seeing the part that plays in the bigger system and the bigger issue that exists around inclusion. I know a lot of diversity and inclusion professionals, I was going to say experts, but I don't like that word, professionals get worn out from the work because it feels like they're just bashing their heads against something. And I think that, you know, that's one of the challenges with bringing these changes about, is this type of change often is led by, supported by people who have lived experience of not having the change. And so it also has a personal impact on them as well. Okay.
I think that's probably a nice place to
Yeah.
close. Yeah.
Thanks a million, everyone.
We've got a couple of minutes in case we're off time just to wrap up. So just to say thanks, Sheila, for joining us. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's such a thought-provoking session, and it's, you know, it's stuff we all need to be thinking more about. And, you know, as I was listening to you over the course of the session, we have to think about it from our own perspectives and, you know, have more self-awareness about our behaviours and our attitudes. And I think that's kind of what this opens up. I always find it really educational. So just to say thanks, great to have you here. Super session. I think those who made it along, I think, got a lot of value out of it. So no, thank you very much. And I'll give you a little hand there because I'm your host, but I'm muted. So there you go. No, brilliant. So no, thank you for that. And we'll share your link for your assessment. Is that cool?
Please do.
Just in the meetups, all those who couldn't actually make it onto the session could still take the assessment. I think that would be useful. And thanks to all of you for joining and engaging in the conversation. I think it was a really educational one tonight, and it's left me with quite a lot to think about. So thanks again for joining. We've got another session for you later this month. So that's Ben Ford's one on OODA loop to do stuff, the algorithm for agility. So that should be really good. Ben's a good guy. And then we're going to start to shift to more of a kind of monthly cadence. So just thought we should break that to you at some point. So Donald and Nikki and I have had a conversation, and we reckon it's probably time to just move to one event a month, and you know, we might dial it back up again at some point. So yeah, you'll start to see us just having one session a month, and I think that will start from September. Got one in for September, that we've got Jana Larson in October. And yeah, before we know it, it'll be the end of 2021. So listen, thanks again for joining. I hope you find it as valuable as we all did. And yeah, take care. We hope we see you again. And yeah, look after yourself. Stay safe, folks. Thanks again. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a million.